Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. I'm your host today, and I'm joined again by Sue Hill and John Mosko from Federated Hermes. And today's title is called The Future of the FOMC Without Powell as Chair. This is an extremely relevant topic to everyone in Treasury and to many in finance and those that love the economy and want to hear what the central bank is going to do. So welcome to the podcast, Sue and John.
Great to be here, Craig.
Hi, Craig. I know it's memorialized, but happy Friday.
All right. Excellent. So maybe I'll start with you, John. I will start with you, John, about the historical recap of the Federal Open Market Committee with Powell. Maybe you can give us the contextual background for this change in the future of the FOMC without Powell as chair.
So, thank you. Chairman Powell was appointed by President Trump 45 and served the term reappointed by President Biden, and his term as FOMC chair is ending next year. And I think President Trump, probably not unlike, I think if you go back in the history books and do a search on Fed chair relationship with presidents, you'll find that it's not unlike any other. The history is littered with presidents and Fed chairmen wanting lower rates, essentially, right? So, and President Trump has been no different. And even though governors are appointed for 14-year terms, the chair is for 4 years, and it's in the middle of the presidential term. So everybody gets a little bit of somebody else's pick. But this was his pick 6 years ago or 8 years ago. So now it's come time, and he's made it very clear that he wishes rates were a lot lower and faster. And, we spent probably the better part of, maybe 14 months talking about his wish to fire him if and when he was reelected as president, which he was. And we waffled through that through most of the year, but I think cooler heads in his cabinet prevailed, and here he is. And so now we're at the point at the end of his term next year where we're looking for a new person. So, I think each Fed chairman, man or woman, has their own way of dealing with the press and the public and their level of clarity. I believe it was Chairman Bernanke who began, Sue, please correct me, who began the press conferences at the end of each FOMC meeting, so that there was a way to communicate effectively instead of waiting. It used to be they'd meet. I think electing a pope had a lot more clarity, but I think they would have this meeting, and then 4 to 6 weeks later you'd see the minutes, and by then we're 4 to 6 weeks past whatever they were thinking about then anyway, and a lot of times things have changed. But I think the press conferences immediately after the meeting gave the ability for the Fed chairman to articulate maybe a little more clearly, or sometimes not clearly, the thinking inside the room when they made the rate decisions.
Yeah, it certainly did. And then there's a whole industry about interpreting the language that's used. How are you open to giving Chairman Powell a grade on his role there? Is that too much to ask?
Well, he made it, so I think he gets at least a B for surviving through 2 presidents. I'm going to go B.
Okay.
I'm not B plus, B minus. I don't know what an A looks like, but he navigated some very tricky waters, candidly, if you think about COVID-19 period. Then following that with, aggressive monetary stimulus from fiscal stimulus, which created the inflation problem we had in the next president's term. So that was tricky. I think he, maybe by design or not by design, kept the markets on their heels, and I'm sure Sue would not be as thrilled about that. But I think there was a tendency to what the pundits, if you will, thought he was going to do versus what he actually did, or I will say the committee as a whole, were two entirely different events over the last couple of years. So I think at the end of the day, I think he's done a very good job. Again, I don't know what great looks like.
There's certainly a lot of pressure placed on that role as the chair, right? Can you ever please everybody with that? I don't know that that's possible, right? And hence the B, C, or D possible range, right?
Well, we didn't tumble into a recession, which a lot of people thought we might have done, and so growth has been growth, and inflation is probably still a little wonky. But I'll leave Sue to give the grade from the expert chair.
In all fairness, I tend to be a little more sympathetic, I think, to the chair position. It's certainly a no-win spot, particularly this year, and markets are tough. So I probably have a little bit more empathy for the chair than many might. I do, though, John. I go back to your comments about transparency from the Fed. Over the years, transparency has increased. They communicate in a variety of forms, and sometimes way too much. So I do kind of miss the old days when we had to figure out what the Fed was doing from non-official sources.
Great. So let me do some quick introduction. Ask you to do quick introductions of your what you do at Federated Hermes, and mostly focus on that just so everyone's familiar with you. We'll go John and Sue, and then the next set of questions I'll start with you, Sue. So John, why don't you just give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So I'm John Mosko. I am National Sales Manager for our liquidity products here at Federated Hermes for North America.
Excellent. Thanks, John. And Sue?
Yeah, and I'm Sue Hill. I'm the head of government liquidity at Federated Hermes. I'm a portfolio manager for our short government liquidity portfolios. A seasoned veteran of the firm, celebrating my 35th year.
Nice. All right. So Sue, I'll start with you on this this next section. The next section I have on our outline is next chair and current governors. So maybe to start back, as Powell was pushing back a little bit on December rate cuts. There was certainly more expectations in the market that there would be another rate cut. He's pushed back on them. Why is that occurring? Maybe give us some context for that.
Sure. So if we take a look at the most recent FOMC meeting that happened in October, the Fed voted to ease by 25 basis points. That brings the Fed funds target range to 3.75% to 4%. The thing that stood out in that decision was not the action itself, because we all thought the Fed was going to ease, but the fact that there were two dissents from the decision. One completely expected, that's Governor Myron. He was the temporary governor appointed to fill Governor Kugler's role when she stepped down somewhat unexpectedly early in August. So Governor Myron is very friendly to the White House, and has for the past two FOMC meetings dissented in favor of easing monetary policy by 50 basis points rather than the 25 basis points. So we know where he stands for sure. The surprise this time around was the dissent from Federal Reserve Bank President Schmidt, who dissented in favor of no policy action at all at the meeting. So Powell has two dissents, one on either side. And during the press conference, he acknowledged a fair amount of, if not disagreement, at least discussion among FOMC members. So having been in the seat for a while, I take from all of that the Fed's somewhat divided. And I think Powell's very conscious decision to include in his formal remarks during the press conference that the Fed has not made a decision about a December move, really was a reflection to appease those members on the committee who may be leaning a little bit more towards less easing. So he's a consensus guy, and I think that was purely for consensus. It's kind of an obvious statement because the Fed, makes decisions meeting by meeting. So to go out of his way to push back, I think, was notable, mostly from the perspective of getting everybody to all get along.
Sue, from a historical perspective, I mean, here we have everybody but two was 25 basis point cut. One wanted 50 and one wanted to stay the same. Is that more of an aberration, that there's, more of a little bit of a bell curve, if you will, as opposed to unanimity?
Yeah, dissents are not uncommon historically, and I don't have the stats at my fingertips, but you see it in meetings, particularly in points of transition from the Fed's perspective. So not unusual to have dissents. Probably a touch unusual to have a dissent with one going in either direction. I'm not sure that in my memory I remember that was the case, where one wanted the Fed to do more and one wanted the Fed to do less. So that stands out a little bit. Actually, the most notable dissents this year, I think, was back in the July FOMC meeting, when there were two Fed governors, so Governor Waller and Governor Bowman, who had dissented from the Fed's decision to stay on hold in favor of a 25 basis point ease, or would have preferred a 25 basis point ease instead. I think that sticks out because Fed governors not in agreement is kind of notable, and to have two was an indication of something going on from the Fed's perspective.
Maybe to put you on the spot a little bit, or at least to hear what you think, do you expect that the next meeting they're going to lean towards dropping a quarter point, holding it as is, or raising it? What do you think the odds-on favorite are from your view?
Yeah, so despite the fact that we do have Fed officials, commenting currently that the Fed, should take it slow going forward and really still needs to worry about inflation, I think we collectively still think the Fed will ease another 25 basis points in December. I think the labor market is in the balance of risks in the Fed's mind between inflation and employment. The labor market maybe is sending some signals that would prompt them to lower rates again. They've acknowledged that policy is on the restrictive side, and that's kind of consistent with the theme of moving towards a more normalized policy. The real challenge the Fed has that could kind of blow my forecast out of the water is that the federal government is currently shut down. And so the Fed isn't getting the normal signals that it gets from the official data in terms of employment, most of inflation, the regular traditional economic pieces that they're used to using to make policy decisions. So the longer the government shutdown goes on, which as we're recording this is now the longest on record, the more the Fed is kind of flying blind, or I think as Powell described in the press conference, walking through a fog or navigating through a fog, and might be inclined to slow it down a little bit. So the base case is Fed still eases, but the lack of data could slow that a bit.
Yeah, thanks for stepping through that. I want to continue the discussion and also continue with you, Sue, but also bring John in. The chair term, Powell's term ends in May. Maybe we could talk about the leading candidates, or what are we expecting to happen? Maybe talk through that. Sue, if you'd start.
We've traveled quite the road this year. John and I talk about it quite a lot. We've gone from, is Powell going to be fired? Will Powell step down early? We're now settled into, I think, Powell will serve out his chair term, which ends in May of 2026. There's a kind of a secondary question as to whether he remains on the committee to fill out his governor term, which lasts for a period of time after that. That's unprecedented and I think unlikely to happen, but it's still kind of an open question. But the debate, really open debate as to who's going to replace him and when that choice will be made, that's ongoing. So we've gone from, I think, an official list of 16 candidates down to now we have 5 candidates that Treasury Secretary Bessent continues to vet. 2 of them are current Fed governors, Waller and Bowman, 2 Kevins, Kevin Hassett and Kevin Warsh, and then we have Rick Reeder from BlackRock. So all 5, I think, have made it to was close to the final rounds of evaluation from the Treasury secretaries and the White House perspective. Who gets chosen, I don't know. I do think it's important for the market to be comfortable with the choice, so that might play a role. They presumably market in general is more comfortable with sitting Fed governors than necessarily some of the other choices who might be a little more inclined to be friendly towards administration policies, but remains to be seen. John, what do you think? What do you think we'll see?
Fortunately, I think the Treasury Secretary Bessent is, in everything I've seen him publicly, a very calm, measured, thoughtful, and seems to have the president's ear. So I think if he is, for lack of a better word, heading the vetting and heading the search committee, I'm comfortable thinking that whomever he's going to put in front of the president to say this is the choice is going to be someone that he's going to be able to, for lack of a better word, sell it to the president in a thoughtful way that the president's going to be happy with, as well as the markets. So I'm with you almost 100% on that. If I just noticed Rick Reeder, which that's an interesting choice. Someone from the markets, clearly a fixed income background, would understand markets behavior regarding changes in short-term interest rates. So clearly a markets person, which I think, candidly, the markets might like, because I wouldn't expect him to be irrational. And then certainly someone like Kevin Warsh, who's had a long background around the Federal Reserve. Again, someone with understanding of how markets behave based on Federal Reserve action. So, folks like that, and then Hassett, obviously, with his relationship with the president, might be the president's choice. But I think at the end of the day, with the Treasury Secretary sort of leading the vetting and the overseeing of what would be best for everyone, I'm kind of comfortable how it goes. So, but I agree with you on your thoughts as well.
When do you think this is going to become, when the president's made a nomination choice or an appointee elect or whatever you want to call it? When do you think we're going to hear that either narrowed down to one or two, or the one that they wants to put forward?
I think it could happen as soon as by the end of this year, or maybe into early January. I do think there's a desire to have someone named and then be more of a, if not so much a shadow Fed chair, but kind of run in parallel to what the official decisions are being made at the Fed. That may not be the Fed's desire for sure, or Powell's in particular, but I do think you'll probably go through a period of time where you have the views of whoever the chair-elect or potential chair would be running side by side with the official Fed views.
Okay.
Yeah, that would make sense, right? If the president wanted to your point, running side by side, there's a case of where the semi-annual presentation to Congress from the Fed, when is that, in February? So he would probably want to get that person at least publicly in the public domain, such that we could hear that person's views sort of parallel to Chairman Powell's views, almost neutering the chairman at his congressional meeting, for lack of a better word.
How I don't want to say tumultuous, but how tumultuous will that be compared to, let's say, Supreme Court justice nomination? Those are always extremely contentious. There's lots of things going on. This is a little bit more nuanced, so it might be finance people who are talking about things. How much of a issue will this be?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a good question. I think the narrowed down list, the 5 candidates who are presumably represent the final pool of choices, I think have been pretty vetted. I don't know. There are some choices that would be more disruptive than others, but the markets had a period of time, I think, to adjust to the potential of any of them. The question will be from Congress's perspective, right? I think it's the Senate that confirms, and whether there's any pushback in Congress against whoever the chosen is. That could be a little bit of a conflict if it happens, but at this point, I think that, that path isn't clear. There are, other things that can happen with the Fed next year as well. So we do have Governor Myron Spot is temporary. He's on leave from the CEA. His position is up at the end of January, and will need a replacement on the Fed, a governor position for him. Whether he stays on or not, I think, is an open question. But I think he has not had, in spite of the open dissents, has not had the influence on the Fed that maybe had been expected. So he really could very well be replaced with another candidate from that pool of five. So between the chair's position and the new governor in January, there's a little bit more of a White House influence, potentially, even without kind of the overt attacks on the Fed that we've seen at points in time throughout the course of this year.
There's different pathways that the FOMC could take going forward. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what might those pathways look like and what feeds into your thinking on this.
So I think as we covered, I think my expectation is the Fed will still ease in December. That's our House view, and that there's incremental easing from the Fed in 2026. Our base case terminal rate is consistent with market expectations as well, somewhere around that 3% level. So that's the scenario where the Fed eases to reduce the restrictiveness of monetary policy. It gets to a certain level that's closer to neutral and more consistent with general economic conditions and the balance of risks, and it's comfortable to stay there for a while. We could have the tariff story take hold. Temporary price impact becomes more permanent. And so we could end up with a Fed that's on hold if they become much more concerned about that inflation side of their mandate. That's not necessarily my base case, but it is at least a potential once the data blackout ends and we really start to see some of the official data that we've been missing for the last 2 months or so. And then the other final pathway that as a money market portfolio manager I'm not all that fond of, but it's the scenario where rates are pushed dramatically lower because that obviously is the administration's wish, or there are economic developments that that force them in that direction. Not a real palatable path for me, nor necessarily is it a high probability. We're kind of in that base case, that returning to neutral case in the for the next couple of years.
Interesting. So you mentioned the data, the blackout of data because of the shutdown, right? So some economic data is not being gathered. How big of an impact is that? Is it across the board that it's just government gathered data? Are they also tapping into other sets of data that's not in this blackout phase, I guess, or blackout period?
Yeah, so the Fed has a really robust research staff that's at the Federal Reserve in DC, but across the individual Federal Reserve banks. So lots of economists, lots of touch points, and the Fed is funded differently, and not by Congress or not through appropriations. So they are open throughout the government shutdown. So presumably doing their thing and collecting data and getting a view, as they typically would, of various metrics in the economy. A lot of that is sentiment-based, how people feel, and survey-based, so not necessarily the hard data, but they have a view on it. But I think as we get farther and farther into the government shutdown and farther from official data sources, it's much more difficult for the Fed to have that the checks and balances of what the hard data is actually telling them. And you need to compare the hard versus the soft data that they have. So I think it's a challenge. And once the shutdown ends, it's not like everything comes out all at once, because a lot of the work still has to be done to complete some of those releases. So, they truly might have a feel. Certainly, we've had a lot of private sector groups putting forth their surrogates for employment data and others. But, their Fed's used to making decisions based on data that they know. So I think it influences them fairly notably the longer this goes on.
That's some really good calibration. Very helpful. This has been a fun discussion, and let's do the wrap up and final thoughts. We'll go John and then Sue. Any final thoughts about what to look out for, what to do, or how to think about this? So go ahead, John.
Thanks, Craig. Well, it's hard to believe we're already into November of the year. I mean, the president was inaugurated in January. It has been quite a speedy 10 months to get here. And I don't anticipate it slowing down given that we have midterms next year. So I think from a political perspective, which we haven't discussed, but I'll just throw out the fact because it does somewhat intertwine. Midterms are somewhat driven by how people are feeling in economic data and work, having a job, and inflation. So it would seem to me that this president will be keenly focused on making sure the economy is in a good position for himself going into next November. So I know it seems like a year away, but we'll be here. But to get there, I'm sure that, so I will be watching things like, what kind of fiscal stimulus, what kind of, any type of ways to help the economy get itself going, maybe avoiding some of these layoffs that are currently been publicized. But lower interest rates obviously are going to be top of mind for him, and ways to keep the economy going smoothly into next November. So that's where my head's at.
Thanks, John. And Sue, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, so there's one thing I've learned from life at the front end. There's really never a dull moment. We think we got things figured out, but things can change in a heartbeat. I think it'll be really interesting to watch the Fed saga as it plays out. Just watch the overall market reaction.
Excellent. Well, Sue and John, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.
Views are those of Federated Securities Corp as of November 7th and are subject to change based on market conditions and other factors. These views should not be construed as a recommendation for any specific security or sector. Due to various risks and uncertainties, actual events, results, or actual performance may differ materially from that reflected or contemplated in any forward-looking statements. Nothing contained herein may be relied upon as a guarantee or representation as to the future. Although the information provided in this podcast has been obtained from sources which Federated Hermes believes to be reliable, it does not guarantee accuracy of such information, and such information may be incomplete or condensed. Federated Hermes is not affiliated with Strategic Treasurer.